Hi, and welcome to the fifth in a six-part series explaining how to quickly deploy a powerful, fast, and scalable data analytics solution using the free components of the Elastic Stack. This video is a continuation of the previous one, focusing on the Kibana data discovery and visualization tool. We'll now be focusing on some more advanced types of visuals included in the default free Kibana distribution. So, starting from the Kibana homepage, we'll click on the Visualize tab and click New. And once again, we see our list of visualization types that we have to choose from. Now, in the last video, we kind of focused on these first few sections, which are kind of the more fleshed out, more mature visuals. But down below are some more advanced types, which maybe aren't quite as mature, but can really extend the functionality of Kibana quite a bit beyond what you get with these more built-in types. So the first one I want to go over is the Visual Builder. Now this one's not quite as easy to use. It's a little bit more complicated. It's got a lot of configuration options. But what's really powerful about it is you can do more flexible combinations of different queries. So whereas the built-in visuals are basically all limited to showing data for a specific filter or a specific query of the data, in this visual you can combine multiple different queries into a single view. Now this will have some performance ramifications, but for the most part, Elasticsearch is fast enough that it's unlikely you're going to really notice. Another thing to keep in mind with this is that it's mostly focused on time series data. Now some of these visuals don't show data in a time series, they're just showing a single sample. But it's important to keep in mind that it's still querying basically bucket aggregations, and even for a single value metric, it's really just showing you the last bucket value for your query. So we'll show a little bit of some of what that means and how to kind of get around that fact. But one of the more useful views in the Visual Builder is the time series view. So if we come down here, we actually see by default, obviously, it's entered the last or the default index that we use, which is probably correct. We have to choose the date as our time field, and auto as before is probably fine. Now there's this general panel filter here which we could use to apply sort of a global filter to everything. And sometimes that's useful, but the real power of this is the ability to do a filter on each specific series. So we're going to leave this blank. Now you'll note that it says ignore global filter. What that means is if this is in a dashboard where there's a filter for the entire dashboard, you can either have this ignore whatever that is or apply it. So generally you're going to want to say don't ignore, so that this behaves just like our other visuals and it'll reflect analysis of the data set that is being shown on that whole dashboard. The other thing to keep in mind on this tab is this drop last bucket option, and this is actually a useful option that's sort of currently missing from the other visuals, which is basically when you're showing buckets on a time series, it's not uncommon for the last bucket to be sort of partial or incomplete. Basically your last bucket might look like it has an abnormally low number of values in it, which can look like a sort of trend down at the very end of your chart. And that can be misleading because really that's only doing that because it's only showing data for, say, half the time period as the other buckets, and so it'd be expected to be lower than the others. But at a glance, it looks like you have this big drop off in a trend. So by dropping the last bucket, you basically don't show any incomplete buckets. So it's kind of a quick way to address that little drop off problem. So something to keep in mind. It's probably a good thing that it defaults to yes. Okay, so before we actually get into creating a visual with Visual Builder, I want to quickly show some of the limitations of the sort of core visuals that illustrates the power of this interface. So let's go create a line graph, and we're going to do this just for the country of Canada because their data is a little bit cleaner than some of the other places. And we're going to go ahead and do an average temperature like we were doing in the last video over time, and go ahead and plot that real quick. Okay, so if we wanted to see, say, the range from min to max temperatures as well as the average temperatures, we could get close to that by adding a split series on a terms aggregation based on the element. So if you remember from the last video, our data is modeled such that mins min temperatures, max temperatures, and average temperatures are all stored as separate objects. And so this is going to sort of split those up and show the average temperatures for just the min objects, the average objects, and the max objects. So this is close to what we want. The problem is, to see the true range of temperatures, we should really be plotting the minimum mins, the maximum maxes, and the average averages. And we're really just doing averages of everything. Now the closest we could get is add additional series that show like the max temperatures. The problem is it's going to do this for all of our buckets. And so we're going to get the max min, the max average, and the max max. And that's not really what we want. And if we add mins, we're going to have another 3 series here, and our chart gets super muddy. So the Visual Builder gives us a little bit more control over this at the expense of some additional configuration effort. So let's create a series here. It's going to be called max temps, and we're going to say it's going to be the max temperature. And we're going to filter this. This is a little hidden, but it's important to remember this. So there's this way to filter just this series. We're going to filter this series on T max. All right. So let's now add a new series, and this will be average, and this will be an average of temperatures, and this will be filtered on just the element T average. And you'll notice that this auto refreshes, so as I make changes, it sort of kicks off a new query. That can be a little bit annoying because of the time it takes to refresh. So you can turn off that, and then you'll have to click auto apply anytime you want to refresh it. So now let's come back down and give another series, which is going to be our min temps. This is going to be a minimum temperature with a filter on element T min. Okay, so let's see what this happens. And we'll change these colors as well since we want them to look different. Again, these are things you have a lot of more control with this tool, but it also means you have a lot more to keep track of. All right, let's hit apply. Probably could have picked better colors for these. Okay, so we finally finished, and now you can see that we have 3 series plotted here. We have the max temperatures, the min temperatures, and the average temperatures. And because we were able to control exactly which aggregation each series gets, as well as its filter explicitly, we're only showing the 3 series, and now we really are seeing what we would expect to see, which is the min of the min temperatures, the max of the max temperatures, and the average of the averages. So another really cool thing about Visual Builder is the ability to plot a filter ratio. So this basically lets you plot a percentage of 2 different queries or filters over time. And this is not something you can do with the other visuals, and it's a common type of visual that you may want to create. And so I've used this quite extensively. So for example, we can show an average temperature metric aggregation like we were before, but now we can add a numerator filter of United States and see what the what percentage of kind of the global average temperature of the United States is. And so you can see from here that, and we can make this a little bit easier by switching over to a percentage indicator. We can see that the United States is cooler on average than the rest of the world, and that's actually been getting more exaggerated over time, which is a little bit interesting. We can also compare it to, let's say, other countries by changing our denominator filter. So if we say Canada, we would expect this to now be a positive number. And indeed, Canada is, or the US is many times warmer than the average Canadian temperature. And if we say compare to Mexico, we should see the opposite pattern. And indeed, we can see that the US is on average roughly half the temperature of Mexico. So anyway, that's just a quick way to illustrate how you can do ratios and plot percentages of 2 different data sets, which is really handy. So the time series visual is by far the most useful here. Metric, for example, it can be useful in some cases, but there are some limitations. And the biggest gotcha with these other values, which are basically not showing time or values over time is the fact that they are only showing you the last bucket of whatever query you have configured. And so in this case, we're showing, trended buckets over time, which makes a lot of sense. But if we look at this last bucket, it's 53.77. And if we come over here to metric, we can see that's the value that's being shown. So what this is actually just showing us is the last bucket from whatever query we're displaying. And that's a little bit not what you would expect. You'd kind of expect this metric to be based on the last 150 years, not just the last, in this case, 1 year out of 150 years. And in some cases, you can get around this by tweaking your interval to basically cover the entire time span. So if we were looking at like a year and it was bucketing it by week, we could override the interval to 1 year. We could say don't drop the last bucket, and it would kind of give us what we want. Unfortunately, it's when you're looking at longer time ranges like I am, it doesn't seem like I can configure this to do what I want because it complains about 150 years not being a valid time interval. So there may be a way that I just am not aware of to make this work, but this is a limitation of this visual builder. As it says, like, it is experimental, it's not super fleshed out, so there's definitely some improvements that could be made to this. So bottom line is some of these other visuals may be useful in some cases, but for the most part, I think the time series is by far the most robust visual type in the visual builder visual. There's one really neat sort of hidden feature of the visual builder, and that's the Markdown one. So this is basically a way for you to configure, using the same interface that we just saw, a bunch of metrics, and then build them or integrate them into formatted text. So this is a way to kind of create sort of a text report with explanations and all that, but embed live data from some queries. And so if we call this guy, let's see, US ratio, and we come over here to Markdown, we can say the average temperature in the US is for the last year was, and we can then use mustache syntax to embed US ratio. And it's really neat. This actually shows you sort of a live preview or example of what your actual values could look like. And so if we do that, we now see that we have text with the percentage that we just calculated embedded in, which is really neat. And we can do other, typical Markdown formatting, make it bold, all that stuff. So this is really powerful, and you can create as many metrics as you want. Obviously, it's going to be a bunch of queries. It may take a little while to load, but you can just start creating more and more series, more and more metrics. We could do, again, the sort of average min, average max, average temperatures, and embed those into our text. And so you create a very substantial report with this, with a ton of values embedded in. Now, obviously, it's not going to be quite as configurable or as powerful as maybe using a notebook builder like Zeppelin or Jupyter Notebook, but considering this is built into Kibana, it doesn't require any new backends, and it uses the same kind of GUI-based, configuration-based query builder, I find this to be a really useful feature that can be really handy in adding some additional context and explanation around your analysis. And the only thing to keep in mind is this has the same limitation of metric and these other non-time series visuals, in that it's only showing you the last bucket value. So in my case, this isn't particularly useful unless I really am only interested in the last year. But for smaller time ranges, which is commonly what these tools are used for, this is pretty powerful. Now there's actually another visual called Markdown here, but this does not let you embed any data. This is simply for adding some formatted text to a dashboard, so not nearly as useful. Alright, the other visual I wanted to show is Vega. So this one's a little bit overwhelming, and it is by far the most complicated to use, but it's also the most flexible. So Vega is actually a third-party library for building very customized, very complex visuals based on the D3 visualization library for JavaScript. And basically, you use a JSON structure to configure information about the data, which in this case is going to be an Elasticsearch query. And then you can do aggregations in memory from the data that was returned by Elasticsearch to kind of pre-format it, do additional analysis and processing on the data before you display it, and then you can have very robust control over how it's visualized using a number of different visualization types and things. So this has quite a learning curve. I'm not going to go into a training on how to use Vega, but suffice it to say that if you're running into limitations with the other visuals, Vega is something that you may be able to pull out of your hat to really kind of create exactly what you're looking to build and overcome some of the limitations of either Kibana or Elasticsearch itself. So for example, if there's some amount of bucketing or sort of second order aggregation that you wanted to do that Elasticsearch doesn't allow you to do server side, you could do that client side in the browser using this tool. Keep in mind, of course, that if you're dealing with a lot of data processing, then you may have RAM limitations and how much post-processing you can do in the client. But that is a possibility, and for certain cases where you're not dealing with a huge data set, this can be a way to even get past some of the limitations of Elasticsearch, not just Kibana. So another type of visual I wanted to discuss is called timeline. There's a couple ways to get to the timeline configuration. One is through a visual, which is right here, and the other is through this standalone timeline app. And both of them can create a visual that can be embedded in a dashboard. From here you just go to save and then save it as a dashboard panel, which can then make it embeddable, and that's essentially what happens when you create it through this interface. But the timeline app itself has a little bit more hand-holding and a little bit more robust of an interface. So this is probably the place to get started until you're really familiar with how to create timeline visuals. So what is timeline? It's basically a more configurable, very time series focused visual builder that has its own domain-specific language for defining a visual and the aggregations and the processing that goes into it. And it has sort of time-based bucketing as a first-class citizen, so you don't have to choose a date histogram to bucket things. It's kind of baked into the interface. So to be honest, I haven't used it a whole lot, but that's largely because a lot of the analysis I do isn't strictly time series based. But if yours is, this can be a useful tool to have in the toolbox. It also has a nice little tutorial to get you started, and we can see that right now, by default, we're not seeing any data. And if we look at this tab, it says, somewhat confusingly, that everything looks okay, but the data is coming from invalid dates. So it looks like we need to do a little bit of configuration. So the first time configuration tells us to go into here and configure a couple timeline settings. And really the main one that we need to configure is the date field, or the time field. So by default it's looking for @timestamp, which happens to be the Logstash default timestamp name, but in our case our times are called date. So if I click save and go back to timeline, now we actually see that it is able to find our data. So our configuration is now valid, and if we click a little bit further into this tutorial, we'll see a little bit of extra help in how to actually create some of these views. So by default it's just showing, again, like the other views, the counts of measurements in our collection or our index, but we can add additional criteria here. So we can say, first of all, that we only want to see our t-average elements, and we can also specify a aggregation, which we'll use as before, the average. So we'll say average, and it has nice little hints to autocomplete, and we'll do the average of temperature, and we'll click run. And so as before, we now have plotted our average temperature over time. So far we have something we could have easily built in the other visuals. But one of the most powerful things about timeline is the ability to do a lot of mathematical functions and chain them together to create complex analysis in this view. It also makes it easy to generate different time series, to configure the color, the size of the data points, all these things. So it's pretty powerful. It just takes a little bit of getting used to the syntax. So for example, if we wanted to also plot a moving average, which incidentally you can do with the other visual builders as well, but I just want to show how you would do it here. You can add a moving average, and if you use their autocomplete, it makes it really easy to figure out what parameters you need and how to specify them. So we'll give it a window of three intervals, whatever our interval is, to average together to create our moving average. And if we hit run, we should now see two time series plotted. The green one or the teal one being our raw data, and then the orange-ish one being our moving average. And so again, this makes it really easy to build up a bunch of time series, and once you get the hang of this syntax, it's a lot less clicking around than you have to do in the other interfaces. So this is a pretty powerful interface for creating visuals specifically based on time series data, and if that represents you and the type of data you're working with, timeline may be a very valuable tool to have in your toolbox and a good skill to learn. And again, we can save this to a dashboard by saving it as a visual here. So that wraps up the main Kibana tutorials. In the next and final video, we'll talk a bit about how to deploy this stack in production and some of the additional functionality that's available as optional add-ons.